Alright, everyone. No squeaking. Good to have everyone here. I'm glad, definitely quite a few new faces today, so I'm happy to see that. So tonight we're having a talk on the intersection of science and faith by our own Rick Townsend here. So, and just looking ahead, there will be a Pancakes and Pontification coming up in October, first weekend of October, the first Saturday at 6 o'clock at Denny's. More information will come out when we get closer to that time. But first Saturday of October, I don't know what day that is. I want to say the 7th. Okay.
October 7th.
October 7th. All right, and at this point, where we're going after, for anyone who wants to come, is either going to be Whataburger or Steak and Shake. There is a vote in the Discord if you want to vote.
Go to the community meetup channel.
Yes, community meetup channel. Alrighty. Well, I will hand it over to Rick Townsend.
Okay. If we kill this. Just because I've got stuff I want to show you. Hey, Byron. So tonight we are going to talk about science and faith and how those two work together. And in my view, they are very complementary. They are not at odds, although the public perception of science and Christianity is a lot of times different than that. So in my view, it's like thinking about it as like two sides of the same coin. Science and faith work together, they fit together, and I'll show you how tonight. So that's where we're going. Again, the way culture sees it oftentimes is we look at faith and reason as pointing in different directions. And that's the standard meme that the culture tries to portray. And then there'll be cartoons like this one, science flies to the moon, religion into skyscrapers. That's a little harsh, don't you think? Or there's this one where scientific truth is this overwhelming big force, but it's opposed by people who hate science. And those are usually depicted as Christians. Not always, but this is Union of Concerned Scientists, which is an atheist organization. And I can make my slide deck available later too, Mark. But anyway, so in our view, this is not the right way to look at it. We think a better way to look at it is that faith and reason actually point in the same direction. And so that's what we're going to try and establish tonight. So I have two simple goals tonight, okay? The first goal is to demonstrate to you, hopefully convincingly, that science and faith are complementary. The second is that science points to an intelligent designer as the creator. And if I can convince you of those two things, then I will have kicked a field goal. Okay, so my goal tonight, at the end, I'll ask you, did I make the field goal? And you'll tell me whether or not that worked, okay? So when we look at Scripture, and we will have some Scripture tied in because it's science and faith and how they fit together. The Scripture actually points to a reasonable look at the creation as pointing to God. And so this key passage in Romans 1, we're going to pick out a few key words. Men suppress the truth, for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has made it, has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived. Now, when we say they're clearly perceived, in what way would they be perceived?
Physically.
Physically, okay. Any other expansion on that? Philosophically, okay. How do we normally perceive things?
Sense.
With our senses, yeah. So if we can sense it and it makes sense, we are perceiving things through our research, through science. I think this points directly to God has given us the ability to perceive what he has given us in the reality that we exist in. So anyway, so again, there are two different ways that God has revealed himself. You've probably heard this before. In fact, I think it was Newton who talked about the two books of God, God's revelation. Could have been, was it Newton or somebody else? That was off the fly. I forgot. I should look that up. But there's general revelation, which is, what's that, right?
I think it was Townsend.
Yeah, right, it was. There's general revelation where we look at the world, and that's the Romans 1 passage. Just looking at the world, God's invisible qualities are obvious. Okay? You look at a tree or you look at an animal, there's no way the complexity of any of those organisms that we see around us could be by accident because there's too many things that have to work together. Interestingly enough, the same genetic material, the same genetic amino acids, that same kind of symbolic information is found in plants as well as animals, as well as fish and everything else. So there's this unifying idea of information that we'll talk about. So that's general revelation. But then there's special revelation where Christians believe that God has actually revealed himself. So if God is a God who wanted to be known, he would have made himself known both in what he made, but also in what he told us about what he made. And that's the written word. And so these two things are not against each other. Again, we think of them as being together. So they're like puzzle pieces that fit together, okay, and lock into place. So they are complementary. Now, where are we going to go tonight? Well, if you're going to go on a treasure hunt, you're going to usually, in the old days, you get a map and you know where you're going and you try to find the secret treasure. But today, nobody uses these treasure maps anymore. Why? A, because they didn't work, but B, because we have these things. And if you want route guidance today, you pull out the thing in your pocket and you go to Google Maps and you plug in where you want to go, and magically the destination appears and your route appears and you go there. It's that easy. So we're going to use, we're going to provide some route guidance, but it's not going to be a treasure map. Instead, it's going to be in the form of 4 different points. And those 4 different points are, first, we'll talk about some definitions, because we got to make sure we're using the same terms to mean the same thing to everybody, okay? We'll go from there, and we'll talk about there's a lot of different tools we can use to investigate these things, and we'll talk about a couple tools that are helpful and a couple tools that are not, okay? And then we'll talk about how those tools can be used to point to the Creator, and whether they do. And then finally, we'll use some case studies to make that point clear. We'll talk about a couple of specific examples of the universe and the way that it is to show that I believe that science does point to a creator. So we'll start with definitions, okay? And so we'll put some post-it notes up here. If I was to ask you, what is truth? What would you say? Yes, Rose.
That which conforms to reality.
I love it. How did you know? A statement that matches reality. A lot of people will say, well, I have my truth, you have your truth, but your definition is exactly what I was thinking about, which is if it aligns with reality, that's truth. So is there a universal truth?
I would hope so.
Absolutely. Yeah, there it is. I mean, we would believe that as Christians. Now, there are other worldviews that we'll talk about very briefly that have different views on that, but so we'll put that sticky note up there. And the next term we want to look at is science. What is science? Well, here's a pretty good definition: a system of knowledge that is concerned with the physical world and its phenomena, and that entails unbiased observations and systematic experimentation. Pretty coherent? So what limitations does science naturally impose on itself? Yes?
It cannot talk about non-physical entities.
Exactly.
Under this definition, mathematics would be excluded.
That's an example of an abstract idea. What is a number? You don't have a physical number. It can't literally, it needs mathematics to do science, but it can't generate science, right?
Yeah, you can't.
Can't generate mathematics by science. Yeah, so that's great. Okay, so that's science, and we'll be talking about that some. And then we'll talk about faith. It's important to know what we mean by faith. In the book of Hebrews, this phrase is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So we can be confident of some things that we can't see. Another way to look at it is confidence in something unseen, but regarding which one has good reason to believe. So as Christians, we don't consider, and for those of you who are new, this is a Christian defense club. Apologetics means to make a defense for, and so we're looking at how these things fit in principally with Christianity, but with other religions. We will talk about some other religions and what their perspectives are. But confidence in something in Christianity is based on evidence. There is nothing we believe as Christians that we don't think there's some evidence for. Do we have 100% evidence on everything? No. But if we have all this body of facts and archaeological proof and historic, he's fine. Oh, yeah, the recording. Okay. Anyway,
I didn't hear what you said.
And we have this body. Let's say we've got 99 facts, and for 60 of them we have good evidence. The other 40 we don't. Well, if all 60 of these are proven and none are disproven by science, we could extrapolate and say, well, we haven't proven these yet. We haven't found this city, we haven't proven this idea. But if all these are proven, then I can probably trust in the others with good reasonable evidence. So for the resurrection, there's lots of evidence based on historic sources that many aspects of the resurrection are the best explanation for what probably happened. And so we look at evidence in Christianity. We don't use blind faith, although we're accused of that sometimes. So what does it mean to believe? Well, believing, that the best definition I like is the conscious or intentional act of placing trust in something or someone. So I can have trust as a retired airline pilot. I can have trust. A new passenger. Anybody here never flown an airplane? Never been a passenger? Well, think about the first time you went on an airplane. If you hadn't been on an airplane before, but you went on one for the first time, why did you get on it?
Because my mom was taking me to Disney World.
That's a good excuse.
Everyone else was doing it.
Everyone else was doing it, right. But did it enter your mind that you might not get off the airplane under your own power?
I think it was too young.
Right, well, anyway, the idea is you placed trust in the airplane because there was good reason to believe that most of the time it gets there, right? Okay, very, very high percentage. Safer than driving, safer than walking across campus, okay? So we place trust in things based on evidence that that thing is trustworthy, okay? And finally, consensus. Consensus is the collectively agreed to position of a group of people. So if a group of people all agrees on something, they can have a consensus. Now that's extrapolated sometimes to talk about, well, the consensus of science is, or the settled science is, okay? Science doesn't have a consensus. Science doesn't have a settled position. Science has evidence which is interpreted by different groups in different ways. So here's another way to look at consensus. The baseless claim that everyone agrees with the speaker's opinion. So if I want to make a controversial statement and I think you won't agree with me, I'll just say, well, the consensus of science is that I'm right, okay? But that's what a lot of people do. And another way this is used when there's unlikely evidence exists. Well, I don't have evidence, but the consensus is, and then you allege that there's some consensus, whether there is or not, but that's the way it's used. And I couldn't resist. Today, there was a cartoon that came out, and I had to show it to you. So here's the cartoon that came into my mail today. And this is sometimes how science is settled, is by silencing the opposing voice. Anyway, timely that this came out today, so for what that's worth. All right, so we're going to start with ultimate reality. And what I want to do is build a picture for what different groups look at, the way different groups look at ultimate reality, okay? And so the way this chart is going to be built, we'll start with ultimate truth, and then we'll say, for example, it's either knowable or it's unknowable, okay? If it's knowable, and we'll add one more qualifier. So if it's knowable and, in this case, it's physical or material only, what would we call that view of the world?
Materialistic.
Materialism, right. And if it's knowable, that naturalism or materialism. And if it's knowable and it's spiritual but impersonal, it'd be transcendentalism. If it is knowable and there's a personal God involved, that would be theism. And finally, if it's unknowable and it's socially constructed, that's postmodernism. Now, each of these views has some ideas associated, and it has some expressions of those ideas. And we won't go through this in detail. You can kind of scan it and see what's happening here. But in naturalism, you have materialism, secularism, agnosticism, scientific atheism, and the expressions are on the right side. You have nihilism, hedonism. For transcendentalism, we have a different set of ideas, and you end up with pantheism, some of these other isms, where there is no reality. In Buddhism and Hinduism, we fall in that category. Theism would be traditional. Theism is what Christians and Jews would adhere to, as well as Muslims. And so those are the expressions there. And then postmodernism, we end up with ideas like pragmatism, anti-realism, perspectivalism, and anti-essentialism, which I had to look up to figure out what they were. But we can go to those later if you're curious. But and then the expressions are this idea of nonsense, which is the Dada idea. That actually was not a guy. It was a set of people who were opposed to war. Well, who isn't opposed to war? I'm retired Air Force. I was in the military for 22 years. I'm opposed to war. Everybody in the military is definitely opposed to war. Nobody wants to go to war, but they want to be prepared to defend if they need. Well, these guys thought that by making nonsense art, that would make their point that war is bad. Okay, war's bad, we get it. So you have these different ideas that fall logically out of your view of truth. So how you look at truth matters. Okay? It matters a lot, and it matters in the way you live your life based on your understanding of truth. So, there's one other idea of truth that I think is important to go through. Here's this guy, and he's trying to figure out if something's true. And now there's two different kinds of truth in this particular categorization. There's objective truth and subjective truth. Now, you've probably heard this before. So, subjective truth, if I ask him what his favorite dessert is, he might say apple pie with ice cream. And he would be correct. Okay, that's the best dessert. But somebody else might say, no, it's chocolate ice cream cake. Now, what's the common denominator?
Ice cream?
Ice cream, of course. You gotta have ice cream in one dessert, right? Okay, but which one is better? Who determines that?
The one answering the question.
Pardon me?
The one answering the question.
The one answering the question. Are there multiple answers to this question?
Yes.
Is there an absolute truth to this question? There is an absolute truth to the question, what does Kevin think the best dessert is? The absolute truth of that would be, put it on the
Kevin
spot.
is indecisive.
So for somebody who wants to commit, the point is an individual's belief about something is an absolute truth for that person. That's where we get into true for you but not true for me, but it's not a universal truth for everyone at all times, at all places. It's true for you in your preference today, which might change tomorrow, especially if you're indecisive. Okay, so that's subjective truth. There's another idea that's objective truth. Now this is an object. This is an anvil, okay? And then if we do this, if we put the anvil over his head, and then we decide we're going to let gravity do its job, is there any guesswork about what's going to happen?
It is dependent upon conditions.
Okay?
Like, are we in the International Space Station?
Right. Let's say we're on Earth, or some gravity-dominated planet. Yeah, no,
Okay.
no, that's fair.
Are we assuming
The point
that
is-
gravity moves downwards?
We are assuming that, yeah. So the point is,
Is there a really
so
strong
the truth,
platform?
the truth of what's going to happen when I release this anvil is dependent on what?
Objective conditions.
The objective conditions, the conditions of the object. So if the truth is dependent on the object and not on the observer, it is objective truth. If it's true at all times, at all places, for all people, it's objective truth. If it is dependent on my opinion or the opinion of any subject, then it's subjective truth. Okay? Everybody clear on that?
Mm.
So the object and the subject. And we won't play this through this logical conclusion. The science cartoon already did that once, right? That was too fun. So, all right, so what Christians believe about science is that science is real, it's good, it's a creation, it's orderly and lawful. Now that last one is interesting. I never thought about that before somebody pointed this out. But it comes from a verse in Jeremiah, and this is what the verse says. This is what the Lord says, if I have not established my covenant with day and night and the fixed laws of heaven and earth, then I will reject the descendants of Jacob and David my servant. What he's saying is, you know how reliable the fixed laws of heaven and earth are. That's how reliable my commitment is to Jacob and David. Okay? So he's talking about their knowledge that the laws of heaven are fixed. That's one of the earliest statements we have, that God is directly connected to these laws of nature. So it's kind of a neat parallel. So in addition to these ideas, we also, so anytime you see an if-then statement, it's really important to connect those two. So if he's established this covenant with day and night and the fixed laws, then he's going to be, he would, if he's not going to commit to those fixed laws, then he'd reject his fifth covenant. So in addition to these other 5 categories, we believe that that nature is precise and mathematical. It can be quantified in many cases with mathematics. It's knowable, it's testable. Because it's repeatable, because it's predictable, we can do things like physics, chemistry, We can look at laws of planetary motion. We can put things in orbit, and they will follow those laws of planetary motion. Yes.
Now, when you say good in this case, do you mean in the sense of like morally good versus evil?
A good design, when God said it was good, it's on the first, when he was talking about creation, so it's in his characterization, it was good the way he had designed it to work.
Well designed.
Well designed, yeah, I think that's a good way to say it.
All right.
Fair enough. Okay. In addition, we believe that nature is for the glory of God and the benefit of mankind. And finally, this is a little bit different, time is sequential. So we believe that things happen in a fixed order, you can't back up and go backwards in time. And that comes out of Ecclesiastes. So these are the things we can know about nature that are from God's perspective. Okay. Interestingly enough, this guy named Frank Turek, who's been here at UT Dallas a couple times, but he wrote a book called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. Why would atheists need God to make their case? I'm glad you asked. We'll talk about that. This is why. Okay, so if you look at all these different ideas about truth, which of these categories would be favorable toward doing scientific research, and which wouldn't care about scientific research?
Naturalism and theism?
I'm sorry?
Naturalism and theism?
So naturalism and theism would care about science, you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, what about transcendentalism?
I don't.
If you don't believe the world is real, or you believe that that we are all God, which is what pantheism is,
Or that it's all an illusion.
or an illusion, then you would in fact not care about science. And anything else up here where you wouldn't care about science?
Postmodernism,
Why?
because it's all subjective. None
It's
of
all
it's real.
subjective, it's not reliable, and so we can ask that. So that's why science has tended to come mostly out of theism. If you look at the Nobel Prize winners, the majority of those, like 60%, have been either from the Judeo-Christian worldview. The other 40% are from unknown or not as religious in origin. So we do have some naturalists who are in naturalism who are interested in science, and we have a lot of theists. So right away, we can see that atheists would need to steal from God from the idea of an orderly universe in order to do science, because over here, there's no reason why the universe should be uniform. So, yeah.
Would a Platonist fall under theism?
Well, a Platonist is from Greek philosophy. They generally were not. They were more a pantheist, as I understand it. You may know more about that than I do. I know Neoplatonism was like in the 3rd through 6th centuries, and it was kind of a rejection of some of the absolute truth ideas. Do you have anything to add on that?
Because I do think, first of all, as far as I know, Platonism, Platonism is probably, I think, one of those transcendentalist ones, because they sort of reject they think the world of forms is better than anything that could exist in this world.
Right, and then you have
Something.
the anti-essentialists who don't believe that, and so,
Yeah.
you've got these different ideas. So I wouldn't think they'd be overly concerned with science because everything's in ideal forms. Maybe that's a good way to think about it. Okay, so that's, any other questions on definitions?
Good.
Okay, well, let's look at some tools. What tools are appropriate and what tools are inappropriate? When scientists in general do experimentation, they use tools that are in line with materialism or naturalism. Why? Simply because miracles don't happen very often, and because the materials that we work with tend to be reliable. So these chairs, if I pick any one of them up and drop it or release it, it will drop. Okay, it's predictable. And so materialism is not a bad thing when we're doing science in a lab. Okay, but we get these scary terms like methodological naturalism. Have you heard of methodological naturalism? It's like Rose threw out a term earlier with something having to do with algorithms, and you use big terms that people think you're smart, and she probably is. But what this really means is it's not as big and scary a term as it looks like. What it actually means is that when we're doing science, that the method we're going to use is natural or materialistic. That's a good way to do science. Because if I'm going to do measure the speed of gravity or how those kinds of different things work. I'm going to use material things in the material world and measure the results, and I expect them to be predictable. So methodological naturalism for many things works great. But as was pointed out earlier, it can't answer every question. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So methodological naturalism is great, but it has some limitations. So for example, if I'm going to do science in a lab, I would use standard lab equipment. I might have some beakers and some Bunsen burners and some scales and all that sort of thing. Those are all hardware that has to do with material science, okay? But if I come across something that can't be explained, there are a number of things that can't really be explained through materialism that we have discovered yet. Among those are the quantum state of things. There is light. We don't really know what light is. We don't really know what gravity is. We don't really know what caused the universe to come into being. When you start getting into those kinds of things for which material science in a lab setting is not appropriate, there may be some supernatural causation that makes more sense than anything else.
Origin of life would be a big one.
Origin of life is a great example. But there's a hard line that's drawn between anything supernatural causation as an explanation and the material sciences. And we say this is okay, but anything on the supernatural side we can't even consider as a source of information. And one of the ways that that comes into being, or becomes a problem, is when we look at biology. So for many years, you guys have probably heard of junk DNA, right? And that was the non-coding regions of the DNA, the genetic structure of different biology. If you are someone who believes that there was a supernatural cause, you might be motivated to look in there and see if there are any patterns that exist. Whereas if you are an evolutionist, you're going to assume that those are vestiges left over from evolutionary accidents, and so you won't look there. So scientists who are oriented toward a creator have started looking at some of these areas and have found huge amounts of information buried in a very difficult to understand code in the DNA structure. We've also found that there's a lot that DNA doesn't explain. DNA explains things like proteins within the cell and how they fold up from the amino acid codes and so on, which were beyond the scope of this discussion tonight. But they don't explain things like, okay, so I've got a muscle cell, it's going to make another muscle cell when it reproduces. And so if it makes another muscle cell, it's like itself, right? And if it makes another muscle cell, where's that muscle cell going to connect to build up my massive bicep? Or where's it going to build up to build the bone into the right shape for the kind of creature that you are? You are not lizards, and you don't want your bones growing into lizard shapes. That would be awkward. But your bone cells somehow know how to connect. We don't know how that works. We know that there is a thing called epigenetics, which is seems to be a non-genetic, not strictly genetic coded information that exists in the cells. We know that there's a gene regulatory network, which we're trying to decipher. Again, really complex stuff. But if there's a designer, then we look for patterns that we would not look for if we're a naturalist who does not believe there's a possibility that there was supernatural causation that infused order into his creation. So there are limitations.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Has that been written about in something compelling and popular level, the blind spots of science that have occurred because of such a thing, or at least we can surmise, like you said, that if you're not going to look for it,
Yeah.
because of your worldview, you want to look, and you haven't looked, and you've missed a bunch of stuff, and you got the Hubble Space Telescope discovering an empty place in the sky full of hundreds of millions of galaxies. Has anybody put that together?
Yes, and I think there's more and more stuff. In fact, I was at a conference. Did you hear about the CELS conference in Denton? Discovery Institute did a CELS conference, which is a conference on engineering and living systems in Denton. So the previous one was 2 years ago. I went to the one this year. And they're getting some really creative thinkers together to quantify exactly what you're talking about and make that understandable. And so one of the examples, we're going to go on a brief rabbit trail, but we'll come back, okay? One of the examples is the idea of adaptive evolution. And so we think now that microevolution, these small changes within species, may be pre-programmed and within certain boundaries. So we see certain animals, and blind cavefish is what they're doing research on. You take a blind cavefish with no pigment in the outer portion of the scales, and no eyesight but eye sockets, interestingly enough. You put that blind cavefish with no pigment into a light environment, and within hours, you start seeing pigment in the scales. And so it looks like perhaps, and they're doing experiments now with multiple generations of these fish to see if the sight will come back. And they're doing the opposite with the same species that is not blind, that lives in streams. They're putting it in a blind cave environment to see, will it adapt? And the blind cavefish have a much more heightened sense of hearing and smell, whatever smell is in water. So they've adapted, but again, within a certain range, and they're the same species. So, yeah, and so all the science that's coming out on how things adapt is on our side of the equation. It looks like a designed process that has certain boundaries that allow animals to adapt, but if the environment goes beyond their ability to adapt, they become extinct. Sorry. So yes, there is research on that, and Stephen Meyer, we'll talk about him in a second, but he's done some really good writing on this as well. So great, and there's more and more coming out all the time.
Be interesting also to do sociological studies or just have people answer surveys about whether or not they change their beliefs because they keep being wrong or trusting wrong
Well, that's
theories,
something,
and that's.
Josh and I have had a lot of talk about that. How do you change somebody's mind? Yeah, when they're set, and the older they are, the more set in their ways they are. Well,
Yeah,
let's
right.
keep moving. So possible solutions. So let's say you are a materialist scientist, and your entire set of ideas, your possible solution set is entirely in the physical world. Okay? Then all your solutions are going to be found where you're looking. They're not going to be found where you're not looking. So for Christians, we have a bigger solution set. We have God and the material world. We have the Creator who gives order that is not directly perceived, as well as the physical. We can work in both worlds. And so if you only have one, here's an example. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh did this. He flew across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927, first man to ever do it. Okay? So almost 100 years ago. I can tell you the story about my dad seeing him when he was a kid before he went over to anyway. So we won't go there. So now let's do a thought experiment. Charles Lindbergh has gotten to Paris. He's landed at Le Bourget and had the big welcoming scene. And this is Charles Lindbergh a few days later walking in the streets of Paris. Now suppose you are his close friend and you don't know anything about his flight, but you know Charles Lindbergh. And you see him in Paris. What would you assume about how he got there? Most likely, you would assume something like this, that he came by ocean liner because that's how you did it. The solution set would not include an airplane flying across the Atlantic. You would rule that out because you don't even know it exists. Now, in fairness, back then you didn't have Twitter, okay? But.
And by the way, where would he put his suit?
I wonder about that. I don't know how he's well dressed. I don't know if he had that in the airplane. He was probably weight limited. At any rate, your solution set would not include an airplane if you don't know it exists, right? And you would be wrong. Okay? Sorry, it's just the way it works. So you'd be wrong. You've probably heard this before. If the only tool in your tool basket is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But if that's your solution set, is a hammer and nails, how do you explain this? There are a lot more tools that are required to build this than just a hammer and nails. You can also, well, we'll just leave it at that for now. So if your possible solution set is limited to the material world, you are going to rule out certain possible causations. But again, for the Christian, we would incorporate the material world into our possible set of things we can look for answers in, and we would have a much better chance of finding something if, let's assume that the truth, just for the sake of argument, is that a God who is intelligent created everything. If we're limited to the material world, we're never going to find that by self-limitation. Okay. So again, think about it this way. Scientists use different tools for different kinds of science. So if you're going to be a lab, you might use some of this kind of a setup with some kind of a beaker and electrical wires. But here, you don't see a beaker or electrical wires. So this is forensic science. What's the difference between lab science and forensic science?
Lab science, you can control what you're looking for.
Okay, you can control everything about your experiment. In the forensic world, or historic science world, can you recreate what you're trying to investigate? No, you can look for clues, right? About what makes, you look, okay, so there's a set of circumstances, and I'm trying to find the best possible explanation, or what we call the inference to the best explanation. And we convict criminals all the time based on the most logical answer to how this crime was committed. But it's different from lab science, and so too often we confuse the two, and we say, well, if you can't reproduce it in a lab, I don't believe it. Well, there's a lot of stuff you believe that can't be reproduced in a lab. And there's a lot of stuff that convinces juries of the truth of something that can't be done in a lab. Now, there are lab elements to that, when they're looking at DNA and fingerprints and all that sort of thing. But you can't recreate it in the same way. So different tools of science are appropriate for different kinds of investigation. So let's use some of those tools, not limiting ourselves just to materialism, and see if we can find a way in which the evidence that we see either points to a creator or doesn't. And I'm going to rely heavily on this book by Stephen Meyer, which is called The Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Scientific Discoveries That Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. And those 3 scientific discoveries are these. The first one is the origin of the universe. The Big Bang idea, the expanding universe, proves that there had to have been a starting point someplace behind the origin of the universe, behind the universe's existence. If it's expanding, then it couldn't have been an infinite universe, which is what Einstein preferred. In fact, you may remember he doctored his equations so that the E equals mc squared thing looked like it was going to be an infinite universe, when his actual research, his math, was suggesting that it was not, that there was a finite beginning point.
And a not so brilliant math person, student, I guess?
It was a priest,
Go
right?
to that?
Wasn't it Laplace?
Georges Lemaitre.
Georges Lemaitre, that's right. Yeah, but he was a brilliant mathematician, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah. So, anyway, so the universe's beginning point
He
is
should
one
be
of those
canonized.
pieces of evidence. The second one is the fine-tuning of the universe. We won't talk a lot about that one. That's one of Alan's big, really strong points. So we won't go into a lot of that tonight, just because he's covered that so many times so well here. But the idea of fine-tuning, why are the laws of physics so universal? Why are they so uniform throughout the known universe? And then the third one is information in the genome of all living creatures, or coded information. So these 3 big discoveries, all in the mid to late 20th century, fleshed out more and more as we go forward, are 3 things that point to something outside the material universe for their origin. You can't have the material world starting from an immaterial source, from a material source. So if you're limiting yourself to material world, you can never explain the origin of the universe. You also can't explain why gravity is so universal, why light works the way it does. Those things are beyond material explanations and coded information. Why do we have information in orderly fashion among amino acids in a DNA structured molecule that is so precisely controlled? Those things cannot be explained without an appeal to a designer. But we see all those things in the human world when we have a designer. And so the inference to the best explanation is that there's a designer. Now, if we have these characteristics, these 3 discoveries, there are some things we can infer about whoever or whatever entity it was that started that whole thing up. First of all, if he created time, space, and matter, he has to be, I'm saying he, but the entity has to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Because you have to be greater than all those things. I build things out of wood sometimes. And I'm not that great, but I'm greater than the wood that I'm using. So when you make something, you are imposing more order onto it than it had before. We see this all the time. So if you're going to make something that is time, space, and matter, you have to be timeless, spaceless, and material. Yes?
Strictly speaking, you can't make something and impart less order on it than it had, right? Like making trail mix, you have your walnuts over here, your M&Ms over here, your raisins over here. You just dump them all in a big bowl. Now they're less ordered.
Yeah, but that's not how I built my Murphy bed. I didn't dump it together. So yes.
Have you ever been to IKEA?
Rose?
So how would you define order?
Order is, that's a good question.
Because, for instance, for the table, it might not see ordered as being a table being topped up. It might see it as being a tree.
Right, so if, let's say this is a wooden table. the tree itself can't do the same functions. It would not have the square edges. It would not have a design to do certain things. It wouldn't have folding legs. It wouldn't have the ability to be transported easily. The tree itself, I mean, if I'm going to use the tree as a table, it's not going to work very well. So order is giving it a shape that is functional that it didn't have before. I mean, that's one way to look at it. I haven't thought about that quite. It's a good question. Anybody have any other ideas on how we could define order in that way?
Conformity to a purpose.
Okay, purpose. So in philosophy, we call that teleology, or having a purpose, or teleological
Teleos.
attributes. Yeah. What's that?
Teleos.
Teleos. It comes from that. Yep.
Oh, that kind of brings to the point of what defines a purpose, right?
Exactly. And how do we define a purpose?
It's usually given by an intelligent agent.
Usually by an intelligent agent.
I say usually, but
Yeah. Well, that's
Always.
one of the things that's happening with gender. Is gender for a purpose? If so, then we can talk about the purpose of gender
I feel like
and what its
that's-
function is, as opposed to whatever we feel like.
I feel like that's a weird tangent that we don't want to get off on right now.
Probably not tonight, but it's just an example of something that has a scientific basis. Yes.
We talked, when Dr. William Dempsey was here last week, he mentioned a pretty rigorous metric for this, which is.
Yeah, one that I could not reproduce what he said. If any of you want to try, feel free, but he's a smart man. Yeah.
I would say it's something to do with entropy, like,
Okay,
the amount of changes happening.
so decreasing entropy, less randomness. would be-
Even more randomness would imply disorder, so I guess the
Correct.
reverse of that is.
Yeah, so either way, so if you want to say order is less entropy because there's less disorder, that might be a way to put it as well.
It's just like-
One more and then we'll move on, yeah.
Optimization.
Optimization,
If-
okay, that's a good
if you
attribute
have-
of order.
If you have a bunch of values that appear optimized for a particular purpose, or to maximize or minimize a particular metric,
Right.
that could be like an example of design. And we make in our machine learning models algorithms that basically just do optimization.
Yeah, I'll buy that. So if you want to build a spaceship, you can go to a Home Depot and get a lot of parts. But Home Depot is not a spaceship, and it takes a lot of planning to put those parts
Yeah.
into a functional thing, whatever you're trying to build. Okay, well, let's keep moving now. All right, so we can get timeless, spaceless, and immaterial out of those attributes. We can also get powerful and innovative. We can also get intelligent when we look at these three major discoveries. And when you look at all those together, we can say that at whatever point this entity chose to put all these things into the order that we find them, he is demonstrating decisive action, and that is always associated with a person. So if I was to give you a list of attributes, I'm going to ask you to tell me what that describes. If I was to say that this entity I'm thinking of is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, innovative, intelligent, decisive, and personal, what would you think of?
God.
I would think of God. Now, maybe you'd think of a really decisive, et cetera thing that isn't God, but in fact, the materialists would tell us, well, whatever force it was all these things, but it wasn't God. Okay, fine. Anyway, you guys are really strange. All right, so to me, those things point to a creator, and we'll use some case studies to build that case a little farther. Yes?
Well, then certain weird groups like the Gnostics would claim that it is some powerful entity that isn't God.
Right, that's exactly right. So you have to, at some point, it stretches incredulity to the point of breaking, right? But at any rate. All right, so we'll go on to some case studies to make this case that using the right tools, it does point to God. So we're gonna use a very small random sample of possible things. So there are four major events that the Bible talks about that form the world as we see it. We're gonna pick one. Okay. So we've got creation, we've got the fall, we've got the flood, and we've got the Tower of Babel. Those four events pretty much determine everything we see on the surface of the planet. From sociology to anthropology to languages to cultures to the physical geology of the world. All of those things are shaped by these events. Okay. Now we can't directly research the fall because everything we have around us, if the fall actually happened, I think the events that were associated with the fall are far bigger than we give it credit for. The changes were far more dramatic, but we don't have any evidence of what it was like before because everything we have now is after that. So we can't really directly investigate the fall, so we'll take that one off the table. We also can't investigate, for the same reasons, whatever happened culturally and linguistically at the Tower of Babel. If God really did create multiple languages and confuse things and people sorted themselves based on culture, all we have now is the remnants that are left over. So we can't really investigate that one either. And that leaves two things. We can investigate creation and we can investigate the flood.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Is there no pre-Babel, stuff, anthropological?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, I mean, if let's assume that there was a language back then and that we would find some cuneiform tablets or something in that language, there's no way to know if that was before or after. So that's the challenge there. The evidence is just indecipherable. Interesting question, but yeah. So these two events, and we're going to say the flood is something I'll talk about on a future time, but not tonight. And so if you're interested in that, I've got a lot of information on the flood. We can talk about what the evidence actually shows. But I want to focus on the creation and just think about that in terms of this idea of science and faith tonight. And we'll close up with that example. So there's a book called Miracles by Eric Metaxas. He starts out with a discussion of what the greatest miracle of all time was. What do you think that would have been? Greatest miracle of all time?
Creation.
Of?
Everything.
Everything. Creation of everything. We, as Christians, we think the resurrection is very important, and obviously it is. But if a God can create the universe from nothing, including life, then bringing a dead man back to life is trivial, even though it's monumental in our theology and the fact that we don't generally see dead people come back to life, etc. Yes?
If God desired to come into the physical universe and actually did it,
And what?
and actually did it, then
Yeah.
some people believe that's the majorest miracle.
But he'd have to have a universe first. Maybe we could debate those kind of things, but so why do we call miracles miracles?
Because they're miraculous.
Because they're miraculous. Okay. And what characterizes a miracle?
It cannot be explained by natural
Exactly.
processes.
It violates the laws of nature. Now, is God breaking the law if he violates the laws of nature?
No.
No, he's not. So if I build a cabinet and decide to put an extra shelf in it, I'm violating the laws of cabinets. But I get to do that because I'm the creator of the cabinet, right? So God can inject himself into the physical world, and when he does so, it is a miracle, and it can't be explained by natural forces. So the creation of the universe is one of those things where some entity injected stuff where there was no stuff before. Okay? Huge miracle. So what does that involve? Well, it involved making all of this. Now, I can make this appear with a click of the mouse or the remote. I can make it disappear. I can make it come back again. I can make it disappear. God spoke it into existence. It says, we have a curiosity about what he did. How many of you have thought about what did God do? Have any of you not thought about that? Put it that way. Okay, show of hands. Who's thought about it before?
Right,
Come
what's
on.
the question?
How God did, when did he do it, how did he do it, how did this stuff all come about? Yeah. So we have this curiosity. He's made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, but they cannot fathom what God has done from the beginning to end. One of my favorite verses about creation. If we break this down, there's two key ideas, and I like to look at different versions. And so these different versions say he's set eternity in their heart. He has put eternity into man's heart, set eternity in their heart, put a sense of the past and future into their minds. I think that's really helpful to think about it that way. We all have this sense of past and future, don't we? And yet we don't really know what happened, but we're curious. And that's the other part. We are curious, but we will not find out what God did. We cannot find out, cannot fathom, cannot find out what God's done. This one, I think, cannot fathom is helpful because even if God was to explain what he did, I don't think we could comprehend it. I don't think we could fathom it, we can't imagine it.
You just said with all our research, which has been amazing.
Yeah.
And all the things I believe, allowed to be seen, we don't know how life originated.
Right.
We don't know what gravity is and all that other
Right,
stuff you said.
yeah, there's things we just can't, and I think if God was to tell us, we would just go, say again, so it's so complex and so elegant that we probably just can't conceive it. Maybe we'll be able to, maybe when we're in his presence, we won't care. Because we're so, just in awe of him in his glory. But he has given us this curiosity, and yet we will never answer the ultimate questions that really haunt us about this and make us curious. So what can we know? Well, we can know a lot of things. So this is a carbon atom. It has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons. Very reactive, required for all of the organic chemistry we do. All the organic chemistry is carbon-based. Carbohydrates and all those things that I can say but don't understand, okay? Interesting thing, if you were to go to the far edges of the universe and grab an electron, if that were possible, and you bring it back to Earth and compare it with any of these electrons, what would it be like?
As far as we can tell, identical.
Identical. Now, what are the odds that you get that kind of uniformity out of every electron, every up and down quark that makes a proton, or an electron, or a neutron? What are the odds that you get that degree of uniformity, and you get the same uniformity of the strong and weak force, the strong force holding these opposing forces together? Positive things shouldn't be together, but they are. That's the strong force. Electrons shouldn't be in quantum levels, but they are. That's the weak force. And we sort of think about it as electrical, but it's really not electrical. We derive electricity through the use of manipulating these forces, but they're not directly related to the quantum forces themselves. We don't understand these things. We know how to describe them. We know how to use them. We know how to use gravity to describe what it's like. We can measure it. It's predictable. We can put things in space and control the orbits, but we don't understand the forces that are involved there. Amazing uniformity. Yeah.
At what point could you say that we understand the forces?
Well, obviously we don't yet, so I don't know.
Right.
But there are certain things we can derive, that we can determine. So, for example, when they discovered that it didn't matter how heavy an object was, it would fall at the same rate. That was a discovery about gravity.
If we somehow managed to describe to come up with a theory that described all of the forces perfectly accurately,
The holy grail of science research. Stephen
would
Hawking
that
was-
be considered? Could we then say that we understand the forces?
We can understand, we can say we understand certain things better. So let's say we figured out exactly how it is that light can be both a particle and a wave, okay? We know it exhibits those qualities, we don't know exactly how it does it. Let's say we discover something about that. That still wouldn't tell us who generated the idea, who the inventor was.
All right.
So to some extent, we can learn more and more about things without knowing ultimate answers. Yeah, somebody else?
Yeah, isn't the assumption that reality is intelligible and knowable more conducive to scientific progress than the assumption that it's all unknowable?
For purposes of this discussion, the point I'm trying to make is that Christianity lends itself to science being knowable and understandable, to some extent. To the extent that we need, to the extent that God has allowed us to understand those things, Christianity is complementary to those ideas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but then you pulled up the verse in Ecclesiastes that says it's unknowable.
Certain parts are unknowable. Yes, I think the ultimate causation things are unknowable. Yeah, but again, the Renaissance scientists and the scientific revolution guys, many of those, and it's part of the, we're not going to talk about that tonight, that's another topic, but many of them were believers, and they fervently believed that God had put order in the universe, and they were looking for the order he had put there that they thought was discoverable. So it was out of their belief in God that they chose to do the research they did. Yeah.
It could be that the unknowability is not referring to like, causes that can be inferred from the physical science, from the natural sciences, like, efficient causes and material causes, but to teleology, Like, we can't fully grasp the teleology of everything,
Right.
right? We can't fully grasp the purpose of, like what everything is made for,
Yeah,
because,
right.
but we can grasp what they are and how they are caused.
Right, so we can do a lot of research on attributes without knowing ultimate causation.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this, at the atomic level, we have this symmetry. We also have it at the macro scale. We look at solar systems, the planets seem to be an incredibly well-balanced mechanism. In fact, Newton thought about it as a machine, that God had put this well-balanced thing together that could not have been accidentally cobbled together by random forces. And yet we find this solar system, and it's in the middle of a galaxy. And that galaxy is in the middle of space with billions of galaxies. I can't conceive of that. The Milky Way galaxy is really big, and it's only one of billions. God has put a really big stage together to display his wonder, and it's an amazing thing. So, given all of that, what we haven't talked about though is time. And I want to bring time into the picture. So the time is another thing that we don't really understand. So there's different ways to look at it. We think about time as the rate of at which we measure the passage of events. Very predictable. We do swimming records and running records and all those kinds of things based on time. Very predictable. Another way to look at it is that the present is the separation point between the past and the future. Now, these are ways to think about time and what it's like to experience time, but they don't help us understand what time is, or how it came to be, and why it's so well regulated. But that raises some other questions. Is time constant? Shockingly, the answer is no. Time is not constant. In fact, we've discovered this through different kinds of experiments in space travel. And so let's talk about black holes for a second. A black hole is something that usually happens, we think, pretty predictably, when a giant star uses its fuel, explodes, and then condenses back on itself. And that incredibly dense point where it condenses back to is called a singularity. Now, there's a certain radius out within that, from that singularity, where the gravity is so strong that even light can't pass through. And that's why this graphic is dark around this singularity. So the singularity is this dense point, and there's a radius around that, or actually a sphere around that you can think of, and it's called the event horizon. Outside the event horizon, it's possible for things to pass by the black hole without being sucked in, but their path through space would be bent. But if you get inside the event horizon, you're going to be sucked in. In fact, the gravity is so strong that light can't escape. Now, from Einstein's theory, which I don't understand, but there is something that's proportional to the speed of light. And what is that? Time. In that formula, time is proportional to the speed of light. So if the speed of light is zero or can't move, what's happening with time inside a black hole?
Well, it's not that the speed of light is zero, it's just that it can't overcome the
Right.
force of gravity.
Right. But if it's not moving, and time is proportional to the rate at which it's traveling, then the rate of time passage would be measured differently inside a black hole. So in our universe right now, there are black holes. There are places where time is being experienced differently than right now. That's the point I'm trying to make. In fact, we see this with the idea of lensing, gravitational lensing, where you have starlight that's actually bent as it passes black holes that demonstrate this idea of gravity influencing light. Yes?
If I remember correctly, there have been some shown examples of gravity messing with time.
Right.
If my memory serves, electronic clocks brought up to the or atomic clocks, whatever kind of clocks, went up to the ISS and came back, had a very predictable time offset.
Correct. And the same was true for the moon landings.
And for to correctly predict the orbit of the planet Mercury, you need to take relativity into account because Mercury is close enough to the sun and moves quickly enough.
And with the
I hadn't heard that one. Yeah.
And with the gravitational lensing, that's the thing that really proved general relativity was during a solar eclipse in 1919. they looked up at the sun and they saw that like the stars right next to the sun during the solar eclipse were in the wrong place.
Right.
That the light from them was bending around. So we have a lot of evidence that that's definitely the case.
So here's my idea, and it's a radical one, but that's okay. I can't prove it, but there you go. But let's suppose that during the creation event, God was doing some very creative things, which he was. He had to do something to get the universe jump-started in a way that everything was stable by the time humans came around. So what if, and again, just a possibility, what if God did something like put the earth inside an event horizon or some kind of a time-lapse mechanism that he devised, such that inside that time-lapse space, time was passing in thousands of years, while outside it was billions of years. Theoretically, you could have a billions of year old universe with a thousands of year old earth, and the earth came first. Because God can do anything during the creation week, and he had to do different things. Now, with the creation week, billions of years, millions of years, thousands of years, we categorically don't know. And that's okay. We don't have to know. What we do have to know is that it implies, whatever happened, the result is a stable universe, which is pretty amazing. Now, Carl Sagan, one of the early guys who was an atheist and tried to make a case for we don't need God, he said that all we need was the right kind of star and the Goldilocks zone. So if we had a right kind of star, right size, right shape, right heat, and we figure out what the right place is in the orbit where the temperature is right, and then we have some planet that we just happen to find in that orbit, and we spin it around, then that's all it takes for life. It's just the right kind of star and the Goldilocks zone. Well, it turns out there's a little more to it. There are numerous physical laws that are required to be exactly, precisely balanced in order for existence, let alone for life. And we talked about several of these: gravity, strong and weak forces, and so on. And all this, according to the theorists, had to happen in the first millionth of a second. Might have been a billionth. You know, when you're talking that categorically, we don't know. Who knows how long that portion was? But it had to be stable really quick. Or if it was too strong, things would explode. If it's too weak, they'd all collapse together. So properties of the solar system: you need large outer protective planets, you need this asteroid belt, you need the rotation axis tipped for seasons, you need all these different things. And then you need, on that habitable planet, you've got to have an atmosphere, the right mix of chemicals, you've got to have an ionosphere to block the electromagnetic rays, all these protective things that are going to be required. There are some guys that wrote a book called The Privileged Planet, and they've outlined over 200 specific conditions that have to be precisely where they are in order for life to exist. And so when you start looking at that, in Sagan's world, where all you need is the right temperature star, basically, and a Goldilocks zone, there could be millions of planets. But when you start putting these other characteristics together and actually looking out there to see what we can find at these extrasolar planets that they're discovering, none of them have quite the right mix, although some are promising. But there's so many features that have to be. Assuming that our planet is accidentally perfect for life, another planet to be perfect would be highly unlikely to be in existence in the universe just based on random forces. So worth thinking about. So the conclusion when we look outward is fine-tuning implies design, and a design implies a designer. We could also say that an expanding universe, by the way, implies that there was what? A beginning point, right? So, and by the way, that expansion is accelerating, which we don't understand. We understand that there is a thing called gravity. We don't know what the force is that's pushing things apart and accelerating that. We postulate dark matter, which we don't understand. It's just postulated to exist because we can't figure out any other way that the universe could be expanding. And we can't detect it, so it's dark. So it's this force. But again, the expansion accelerating definitely implies that the universe had a beginning. And a beginning requires a first cause, or a primary cause, as we would say in philosophy. So let's think about extrapolating. Okay, we know what we have today. Let's extrapolate backwards, okay? So let's say you have this kind of a thing, okay? And you're going to do some archery. And what do you need in archery? You need an arrow. Okay, so here's our arrow. Now, let's say you have a target and it has an arrow in it. What can you know from that?
Someone shot the arrow.
Someone, well, probably
Maybe
they
they
could have,
just stuck
they
the
could have stuck
arrow.
it in there.
Kevin cheated and went up there.
So you know the direction of entry? Do you know how far away the archer was?
No.
There's a lot you
You
don't know.
could use some ballistics
of the arrow.
and,
I know, I'm
I'm
thinking you
glad
could
that you
look at
brought
the
up ballistics,
and-
because suppose you had something like this, okay? And so somebody shoots a bullet and it goes through the window. Now, we have ballistics that can give us some ideas about what their trajectory, let's say it started here and ends up in hopefully missing everybody, it's in the wall over there, just in front of Greta. It missed her foot, good deal. Okay. We know the angle, but do we know if somebody was just outside the window shooting, or do we know if they were a mile away and it was a random shot?
Do we know if do we know their altitude? Because in that diagram, theoretically, they could have started closer and higher up and been aiming downwards.
Right, could have been really close, or it could have been a mile away with we don't know, right? So when we extrapolate, we have to make assumptions about what we're looking at, okay? Well, the same is true when we look at the universe. Now, in this case, this is a model of the universe from and the event horizon they show right in this part right here. They show all this time, this is the time thing, but this is before time, space, and matter come into existence as we understand it. So how did they do that? We don't know what this was over here, but it's a nice diagram, right? Okay. Or this one. Now we have kind of a flat starting point, and everything spins out of there, including galaxies. And then this one, where, again, everything spins out, and eventually we get the thinker over here. These look kind of like aliens over here, I'm not sure what this is.
those are
Part of
forks forming hadrons.
Okay, fair enough. So this is another model. So this one has a bell shape. And one of the questions I have is, if the universe is accelerating, what does this curve actually look like? And what does, I don't know what the mathematics are. If anybody comes up with that, let me know. Like, what does it really imply about how long the acceleration has been taking place? How fast is the acceleration? We don't know. But we assume that we are at the end of this bell-shaped time representation, and we're observing, and we're trying to extrapolate backwards. And scientists assume that we can extrapolate back to a starting point. The problem is we don't know if that's where the starting point was. What if the starting point was more like this? And God created a fully formed universe, and we're observing a certain portion of it. Or what if it was more like this? Or
And
what
that
if
came
it was
into
more
being
like
last
this?
Thursday.
Where it's so, such a thin slice of time that we can't even represent it graphically. The problem is that that time arrow on the bottom is something we don't really know for sure how far back it goes. We only see a very small snippet, that very shallow end right now. So we might as well just do this. Just erase the arrow, because we don't know anything before that point, right? We don't know how much of the arrow we've actually observed. Have we observed a lot of it in human existence, or only a tiny slice? Yes.
So.
You have the answer to that? I'd love to hear.
Okay, yes, never mind.
Okay. So the point is, when you extrapolate, it's easy to make mistakes, yes.
And it's not that, I mean, extrapolation is bad, because you have to make some extrapolations
Sure.
when you're doing those types of experiments, but you just have to be honest about what the assumptions that you're basing your experiments on.
And realize that the extrapolation
Could be wrong.
may be exaggerated.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, the primary assumption behind the extrapolation of time backward to that extent is the constancy of the vacuum speed of light.
Okay, but how
Which-
long has it been going?
Which,
The vacuum speed of the speed of light.
the vacuum speed of light. So certain distance measurements, we say, oh, this is blah 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 light years away. So that event is blah 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 light years old. No,
Right.
blah blah light years old. Blah 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 years old.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so, you're right, so we make reasonable assumptions based on the observations we make. those are not unreasonable things, but when we extrapolate beyond what we know for sure, we just have to recognize, as you said, have some honesty about the extent to which let me kind of finish it up, and we'll do some questions at the end. So let me just finish up here, and then we'll open it up for questions. So there's one more issue that I want to cover, and that is the 6 days versus billions of years issue. One of the things that has been interesting to me is to observe that within the Christian community, there is more animosity between people who disagree on this issue than outside the. So people are strongly opposed to let's say that you are a billions of years person, and you come into contact with somebody who is a young Earth creationist, those dreaded people. Okay? You hate them. You are vociferously angry. You're probably more irritated with them than you are the atheists. Okay? And yet there are sincere people within the Christian camp who sincerely disagree on this very issue. My point is, we don't know, so don't make a big deal about it. Because there are lots of things we do know with fair degree of certainty. We know Jesus walked the earth. We know that historically the city of Jericho was taken down by walls falling outward from the foundation. But there's lots of things we know, so let's focus there, and not on the things that can't be known with certainty. And so let's have some more grace toward people who disagree with us with our narrow position in these highly charged areas. Yes?
Quick comment, and maybe you can comment later. 6 days, people, young Earth creationists, are all about geology, almost entirely. Billions of years, old Earth creationists of different stripes are all about astrophysics.
Yep.
So maybe that's an imbalance on both sides. Who knows?
Yeah, and just without getting into the whole flood thing, but I would say there's more evidence for a recent flood than there is for either 6 days or billions of years. The billions of years is a reasonable assumption from the astrophysics. Are there ways, and that's what I tried to go to earlier, are there ways that God could have done it in a very creative way? Sure, he's a creator. So we just don't know for sure how he did what he did.
The billions of years still isn't enough for evolution to create life.
No, absolutely not. Naturalism can't explain evolution even in trillions of years. Billions of years is a young Earth for evolutionary terms. And we didn't have billions of, well, maybe 4 million years if the old Earth people are right, if the young Earth people are right, not so much. But again, maybe in a future session I can go into some of the flood stuff, but I think there's really good evidence for a recent flood, as opposed to whatever happened before that. Could have been billions of years, could have been 6 days, 6,000 years ago. We just don't know.
Well, one of my colleagues is a PhD in biology, and he is agnostic on this topic.
Yeah.
But therein lies the problem. To be agnostic is to be an agnostic.
Yeah,
And so you're not a Christian.
even that's something that would, yeah.
It's just a term.
Yeah, so even, and I'm sort of in that camp as well, I don't take a position on whether billions or thousands. I don't care. I don't know. But I will say this, whatever God did is consistent with his word properly understood and with the science properly understood. When we think there's a contradiction, we either don't understand one or the other, but there is no contradiction. We just may not fully understand how the resolution works out. So with that in mind, there are certain things we should hold with an open hand. I think the age of the universe is one of those things. Other things we can hold with a more firm grasp, and those are the dogmatic things about the reality of the fact that there was a creator, as opposed to exactly how or when he did his creation. Okay. With that, I will open it for questions, but if you have a moment, let me show you a short video, which was probably, I could have done this instead of my talk, but this is really good. I want to show you this. This is a 4-minute one, and then we'll open for the rest of the questions. Let's see if I can use it full screen.
You're in a conversation about faith, and someone says, you can't believe in God if you believe in science. You must choose. What would you say? If you ever hear this argument, here are 4 things to remember. Number 1, many of the founders of modern science were Christians. According to historian Christopher Armstrong, modern science emerged out of the medieval encounter between Christian theology and the thought of Aristotle. That's why he continues, when such devout men as Roger Bacon, Albertus Magnus, and Thomas Aquinas processed Aristotle's natural philosophy through the Bible and Christian tradition, they laid the foundation for science as we know it. In other words, modern science did not arise despite religious belief, but because of it. As C.S. Lewis puts it in the book Miracles, men became scientists because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. This is why science arose in the Christian West and not elsewhere. Other later scientists, such as Kepler, Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Faraday, and Clerk Maxwell, were all firm believers in God. These men weren't scientists despite being Christians. Instead, their faith moved them to discover more about the world they lived in. Far from hindering modern science, faith in God was a motor that drove scientific advancement. Number 2, many excellent scientists today are people of faith. Between 1901 and 2000, over 60% of Nobel laureates were Christian. Although the number of believers is shifting in sciences, over 60% of scientists at elite schools today currently either claim not to believe in God or are uncertain of his existence. Christian apologist Rebecca McLaughlin has pointed out that many excellent scientists still do, including nuclear science professor Ian Hutchinson, professor of aeronautics and astronautics Daniel Hastings, and electrical engineering professor Jing Kong. If these scientists are people with deep, sincere religious faith, there may be a misunderstanding by some about what religious faith is, but there cannot be an essential conflict between being a scientist and having faith in God. Number 3, science and religion are complementary. Science and faith are not in conflict. In fact, they are complementary. Imagine there is a boiling pot of water, and someone asks, why is this water boiling? You could say, because heat energy from the gas flame is being conducted through the copper base of the kettle and is agitating the molecules of the water to such an extent that the water is boiling. This is a true statement. But you could also say, because I wanted a cup of tea. Though very different, this is also a true statement. One explains how the water boils, while the other explains the reason for the water boiling. So it is with science and religion. They are not in conflict. They are complementary, as we seek to understand both how and why. Number 4, science can't explain everything. Science describes the laws of nature, but it can't explain where matter came from. It can't explain how life began. It can't explain the purpose of our lives, what it means to love, or why we desire to do things we know we shouldn't do. As C.S. Lewis wrote in Meditation in a Tool Shed, one must look both along and at everything. The fact is, science or religion is not a mutually exclusive choice. Instead, it's more like learning to walk and chew gum. So next time someone tells you science and religion are in conflict, remember these 4 things. Number 1, many of the founders of modern science were Christians. Number 2, many excellent scientists today are people of faith. Number 3, science and religion are complementary. Number 4, science can't explain everything.
So, I didn't have to give my talk, I just should have shown you the 4-minute deal, right? But that really is helpful. It talks about why the water boils. There are 2 different answers. So let me thank you for letting me come tonight. It was an excuse to wear my Reasonable Faith shirt, which I only do when I speak here. So that was fun to drag that out. But seriously, you guys are always fun to hang out with, and I appreciate your great questions and interaction. So we can continue that. We have kind of a charter where we release anybody who wants to go and not feel awkward at 8:30. I know you guys have studies and students have work to do.
Suspend
But if
gravity?
you- but- What's that?
You suspend gravity and they can float on it?
Something like that. But if you want to stay, I will be here as long as you want for any questions. So any questions that you want to continue with, what do you got? What other questions you got? Yes, sir.
I guess kind of going back to the materialism versus religion earlier in your talk, I guess the question kind of is, where's the line? Because on the one hand, the materialist approach to science is going to say, well, I want to explore and I want to find more information out, but at some point they've got to recognize what the limit is, and there's certain things that I can't answer through this methodology. But on the other hand, the religion also wants to say, hey, I want to find out more about God, but at some point I've got to realize that I've got to rely on material investigation in order to
Yeah.
figure out that information.
Well, I think you answered that question earlier when you talked about the difference and the fact that we need to have an honest assessment of what each can bring to the table. So, yes, materialism is a great tool for investigating things that are within the material universe, but again, when we get to these questions of ultimate causation, of purpose, of meaning, that's where we have to be honest and say, well, yes, we understand that gravity works, and we don't understand a lot about how it works. We don't know why it was originally invented, if there was a greater purpose than we can determine through just its characteristics. So I think your answer to that was pretty good, is each has to recognize the limitations. Religion should not jump to, what's been accused of Christians of being the God of the gaps. Anytime there's a gap, oh, God did it. Well, Christians who are involved in science typically haven't used that, although it's been a charge, and some Christians probably have used that inappropriately. So we need to be honest about doing the hard work. There's some science that we can do here and maybe learn some more, versus we'll never probably figure out the origin of life from materialistic causes, so we should be willing to say, well, there's design, let's look for the design, and rechannel our efforts into an area that is productive and in concert with reality. Yeah, Josh.
So I'll try to be succinct. So in my experience, I grew up in a Christian school environment. I was basically taught about the resurrection in that context, the physical, historical event of the resurrection. At the same time, in the Christian school, I was taught about a young earth and opposition to evolution. I go to college, I'm in a campus ministry, we're talking about the resurrection in the dormitory, but I'm also a biology major. And in the course of being a biology major, the textbook is really thick. The section on evolution is extended. The science professors, and I believe they would do this at UTD as well, is they would say that there is a scientific consensus about an old Earth and about the relatedness of all species in a family tree. Okay, and what they would argue is that this solves certain problems that scientists are trying to look at. And they would back it up by saying the National Academy of Sciences says there's a consensus, the American Association for the Advancement of Science says there is a consensus. So as a student, I was caught between, in my case, Campus Crusade staff that I was asking these questions to, and my science professor, kind of like two authority figures.
Sure.
And so my question is, and I'm kind of a nomad here in terms of asking, searching, is what do you think of the Baylor solution, or the Catholic solution, which is to say that there were natural processes, but God guided the process?
Well, I think, again, we have to be careful about extrapolation, but I think if you were given answers by your Christian side that said the science doesn't have any answers at all, that would be wrong. And if the scientists were telling you we have all the answers, that would be wrong as well. And so it's one thing to say the family tree solves problems. It's another to say there's evidence that the family tree actually was the way things happened. We don't have that evidence today. We do not have it. We do have evidence of stasis, and Gould, with his work on punctuated equilibrium, came to grips with that, and he didn't have an answer, but he described something that he saw without an explanation. The idea of a creator creating things according to kinds, as it says he did in Genesis, explains that better than the family tree does, because the family tree cannot work in terms of naturalistic explanations for how increasing order, increasing complexity, increasing sets of information were encoded into a genome to create a different animal from what we had to begin with. And so there is no mechanism that has been discovered. I mean, you're not reading any books that are coming out on great breakthroughs in how evolution happened. What you're reading when you see a book on evolution is a story that's an explanation, but an explanation is not evidence. It is a just so story. It is this is what we think happened. Okay, so let's do the hard science and say, is there a mechanism that could explain how a frog became a mammal, an amphibian became a mammal, or a reptile became a bird? We don't have any mechanisms for that. And so I think the materialist scientists owe an explanation that's honest as well, to say, well, we don't know. They did that in 2016 at the Royal Academy meeting in London, where they started saying, we don't have a workable explanation for evolution. And they came up with, I think there were 17 papers that in their individual disciplines of biogeography and different disciplines, they said, I don't see evidence that my discipline could have explained evolution, but I'm sure it's someplace else. Well, all 17 disciplines were doing this, because in none of the disciplines did it. So I think, again, going back to your answer, I think each side has to be honest about what it can answer and what it can't, and what it has answered and what it hasn't.
What do you think about the theistic evolution? The theistic evolution?
I think there's no evidence for it. I think there's no evidence that it occurred that way, let alone, yes, God could have injected himself in multiple points, but there's no evidence that that's actually what happened.
Dr. Bolin at Probe is doing some good work on that.
Yeah, so again, I would not, part B of your question, I think, is how do we reach people with differing views? And we don't reach them with this area. We reach them with their heartfelt needs for relationship, with dealing with shame, with guilt, with all those things that are the deeper rooted causes of our alienation from God. Those are the areas that we can connect with, and as they have questions about evidence for our faith, we can go into all kinds of detail on that if they have questions. But we have to be honest too about what we don't know. So I would focus on the areas that help build up our faith in the things that are, the firm grip dogmatic issues about the nature of Christ and what he did, versus the things that are, subject to some interpretation. Let me go over here and then come back. Yeah.
What's your opinion on the fossil record? Because it would seem like after a certain point, like after the Cambrian explosion, there's like a ton of biological diversity that wasn't there before.
You have to go back to my flood description sometime, if you guys schedule me for a flood, but it's a complicated issue. But the snapshot is this, and you asked my opinion. I think the evidence is a better place to go than my opinion. The evidence is that the fossils that we see were put into place with a specific event in time. It's not a historic record over millions of years. It's better explained as a record of what is happening at the point where all of those things were buried in thousands of feet of sediment. That explanation is better coming from a flood than from millions of years of deposition in areas where there's no deposition occurring now. So again, that's a more detailed talk for another time, but that's the short answer.
And I just want to know, like, if you subscribe to like spontaneous generation, which was the opinion of I think Isaac Newton as well, that all these diverse animals just
Lamarckianism, lots of people have come up with different ways that new features could have been injected into the creation order. I would simply say we don't know, but there's no evidence that that's what happened. Again, a better explanation for why the fossils are where they are in the layers comes from a flood scenario. But again, however old the universe is before that, we don't know. But
I was saying, like, assuming even a flood, like, where did all this biological diversity come from?
You're gonna make me go there, aren't you? Biological diversity, I think, came from the Creator, and from when God was creating according to kinds in Genesis. Whenever that happened, however that happened, I think that's where the diversity happened. And what we've seen is a decrease in diversity since then as animals go extinct. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you mean. That's how I
was saying, like, the fossil record would show an increase in diversity over time.
You talked about punctuated equilibrium.
If I might interject for a second, this might be a discussion better had after the meeting, because
Yeah.
there's a bunch of us in chairs waiting to go to, according to Reserve Steak and Shake.
So again, you can leave anytime you want.
That's fair.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say it's probably gonna be best for, I was waiting for 45, but it was probably gonna be best for us to like stand up and everything, that way people
Yeah.
aren't pressured to sit. But
Yeah.
anyone who wants to continue talking with Rick Townsend, feel free to just go up and keep talking to him. But thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
And yeah, I actually think the vote was tied because apparently no one voted between Whataburger and Steak and Shake.
Okay.
So I'm inclined to go with the one that we've gone to before.
I voted.
Raise your hand if you're okay
Too
with
late.
going to Whataburger.
I've voted.
Okay,
Check the-
raise your hand if
check
you're
the
okay. Raise your hand if you're okay with going to Steak and Shake.
Check the online.
It is
vote.
tied. No, it is Steak and Shake. It is by one. Steak and Shake wins.
Yes.
All right.
Wait, but is that okay? 'Cause
It's in
I don't wanna
community.
like drag everyone to
no,
like.
That's what I'm.
I mean, it was-
Meetup is on Discord.
It was
so
close
I
enough.
would have to step outside the building. to
Oh,
see it.
you don't have Wi-Fi?
Oh.
I do have Wi-Fi, but I don't.
Right, I
have
didn't
Wi-Fi.
think about that.
But you can use Wi-Fi.
Rob, you're live.
Oh, hello.